Welcome viewers, I am Dr. Tarang Kapoor and I teach philosophy. This lecture will discuss utilitarianism, which is one of the most important theories in normative ethics. We shall discuss utilitarianism with special reference to Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill's versions of the theory. In the lecture on Introduction to Ethics, we have already discussed approaches to study ethics. They are normative ethics, applied ethics, and meta-ethics. Normative ethical theories have made an attempt to arrive at principles that can act as justification for categorizing an agent's actions and beliefs as right or wrong. Utilitarianism is a normative ethical theory. Utilitarianism can be seen as a form of moral consequentialism, which focuses on the consequences of our moral actions. It represents a teleological and consequentialist approach to the ethical questions like what is a good action? The word utilitarianism was originally coined by British philosopher David Hume. Hume believed that it is a good for an action to have utility in the sense of making yourself and others happy. It claims that an action is right if it brings about more happiness than any other action. Right or good action is that which produces the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Thus, moral worth of an action becomes dependent on the resultant happiness. At the same time that Kant developed his deontological theory, which relied on an a priori principle of reason, inspired by David Hume, Jeremy Bentham and J.S. Mill developed the theory of utilitarianism as an empirical approach to morality. Utilitarianism is a part of empiricist tradition in philosophy, which argues that we know what is good only by observation, whereby we appeal to our experience in order to know what is good. According to utilitarianism, the moral worth of an action is determined by the consequences an action produces, and not any other factors like motive, intention, among others. By making actions moral quality dependent upon consequences or results, utilitarianism as a normative theory is opposed to a deontological theory, which we have already discussed in the last lecture. In as far as this utilitarianism takes an empirical approach, it does not make us rely on any controversial moral intuitions. In life, people have to be happy, and we can work out empirically what will make them happy. To do the right thing, we should consider the consequences of different actions and whatever we could perform and choose whether that action will bring about or is anyway likely to bring about greatest happiness or not. An action may have pleasurable or painful consequences, and only pleasurable consequences should be desired. The factor which makes pleasure desirable, according to utilitarianism, is its satisfaction giving quality. Since utilitarianism rejects the idea that certain acts are intrinsically good or intrinsically evil, they are then open to experimentation and advice. They are open to lay out various ways of conceiving the goodness of these consequences. Moreover, a classical utilitarianism is a pleasure or happiness theory. It intends to reduce all other goods to some form of pleasure or happiness. In the history of philosophy, there are other theories on how to understand happiness, like those put forward by Aristotle, which focuses on happiness as the virtue. However, this articulation defines happiness in a very different way from the classical utilitarians. Jeremy Bentham and J.S. Mill have put forward a theory of morality which is based on the principle of hedonism. The term hedonism is derived from the Greek word hedon, which means pleasure. It indicates the natural pleasure-seeking instinct of mankind. The classical roots of the theory can be seen in Epicureanism. According to Epicurean, good life is the pleasant life, that is, which avoids distress and desires for things beyond our basic needs. Bodily pleasure, mental delight, and peace are the goods good life sought, sorts out in this world. Now we come to a distinction between two kinds of hedonism, psychological hedonism and ethical hedonism. Let me now explain what is psychological hedonism. Psychological hedonism is a statement of fact which seeks to derive its validity by stating that pleasure is the natural and normal object of desire. However, ethical hedonism, in contrast from the psychological hedonism, is a theory of value and presents pleasure as the sole criterion of judgment when it comes to judging actions to be right or wrong. Thus, pleasure is a proper object of desire according to ethical hedonism. So, ethical hedonism talks about value theory. However, the psychological hedonism talks about a statement of fact, that is, pleasure is what we seek. Now, we also need to look into the distinction between egoistic ethical hedonism and universal ethical hedonism. The egoistic ethical hedonism regards the pleasure of the agent as the standard of morality. Human beings ought to act in their own self-interest. See the word ego, it derives its validity from self-interest or ego. So the standard of morality which is derived from one's own self-interest is egoistic ethical hedonism. Now, universalistic ethical hedonism, contrary to egoistic ethical hedonism, takes general happiness or the greatest happiness of the greatest number as the standard of judging the moral value of actions. Here we talk about the general or the altruistic version of happiness. Jeremy Bentham was a student of law and was a leader of a radical movement for social and legal reforms based on utilitarian principles. In his book, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislations, he gives a hedonistic formulation of the theory. Pleasure is the supreme end of human beings, and there is nothing in the world that can be held to be good except pleasure. Other things are good, but they are good only if they are conducive to pleasure or act as a means to achieve that pleasure. Actions then are good when they produce a surplus amount of pleasure over pain, and they should be rejected when they bring a greater amount of pain over pleasure. Bentham relies on psychological hedonism. It's very clear from his articulation, and he believes that pleasure is the only motive of actions. Hence, Bentham writes in his book, and I quote, "Nature has placed humankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It was for them to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do." Unquote. Bentham's quantitative hedonistic utilitarianism can be understood with the principle of utility which he prescribes. According to this principle, actions are morally right or wrong depending on their consequences and nothing else. Happiness is pleasure and absence of pain. An act is right if it maximizes what is happiness. That is, if the action leads to the greatest happiness of all those it affects. Things such as fame, power, education, freedom may be good, but they are good only to the extent that they produce pleasure or happiness. Then, philosophically speaking, we have to talk about the notions of instrumental good and intrinsic good. Instrumental goods are instrumental in attaining the goals of happiness and pleasure. Happiness and pleasure are only intrinsic good here. Anything else is merely an instrument to achieve this intrinsic good, namely pleasure. The theory is called utilitarianism because it maximizes the utility. which Bentham defines as the property of some object or action to produce any benefit, advantage, pleasure, good or happiness. Bentham argued that we can measure pleasures and pains and add them up on a single calculus. This process is called the hedonistic calculus. Now, hedonistic calculus comprises of the following factors: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extensity. We should now look into these factors one by one. Now, intensity indicates the quantity of pleasure. How much pleasure? It can actually be quantified according to Bentham. Duration means how long a particular pleasure is capable of lasting. Certainty means whether pleasure will be available in future or not, how certain we are of the lasting impact of this pleasure. Propinquity is about how close in time pleasures would recur. What is the recurrence of these pleasures? Fecundity or capacity for healthy growth is also one of the quantitative factors of hedonistic calculus. Next on, we come to purity. Purity talks about whether pleasure is devoid of any pain or not. So there can be pleasures which are mixed with element of pain, and there are pleasures which are pure pleasures. Next and the last factor of hedonistic calculus is extensity. How many people are getting affected? The number of people this pleasure impacts. So it is about the calculation of the extent or reach of pleasures. Now, obviously, if a pleasure is more intense, it will last longer, is more certain to occur, will happen sooner rather than later, or will produce in turn many other pleasures, and few pains, it counts for more. In thinking what to do, we also need to take into account how many people will be affected. The more of us affect positively and the fewer of us affect negatively. That is what is desirable according to this thesis. In the last factor, extensity, Bentham turns towards the utilitarian ideal of the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. The total amount of happiness produced is the sum total of everyone's pleasures produced minus the sum total of everyone's pains. Thus, Bentham recognizes only the quantitative distinctions among pleasures. Pleasure is measurable on the basis of these 7 dimensions, and there is no acknowledgement whatsoever of any qualitative distinction among these pleasures. Bentham argues, and I quote, quantity of pleasure being equal, the pushpin, that is a children's game, is as good as poetry, unquote. So this very clearly showcases the quantitative dimension of pleasures in Bentham's utilitarianism. There are several limitations of Bentham's thesis. Let us look into few of them. Bentham's hedonism has been criticized for being too simplistic, uninspiring, and very crude in nature. Bentham never specified the exact nature of pleasures and pain. The term pleasure connotes bodily desires and appetites. Bentham's hedonism was rejected by promoting a life which was only interested in pursuing some kind of gross, crude pleasures. Hence, it was criticized as a doctrine which was worthy only of swines. Next in line is Bentham's assumption that pleasures and pains are measurable, objectively quantifiable, and comparable between one another. But this raises a question: are humans able to quantify their probable outcome and about pleasures and pain before they undertake any action? One person's pain might not be similar to another person's pain, and same applies for one person's happiness being not similar to another person's happiness or pleasure. So in this case, how are we ever going to measure and compare the two. Now, the third kind of limitation of this thesis is that external sanctions, which Bentham talks about, and we are going to discuss them at length when we discuss Mill's version of utilitarianism, they cannot be used to control our moral conduct. For example, fear of punishment or, being used as a motivating factor in moral actions, because instead a person should do what is right out of respect or reverence for the moral law, as we saw in Immanuel Kant. There should not be a sense of oath or obligation in the form of a compulsion of due to arising due to the fear of punishment. Psychological hedonism in this context fails to justify any ethical hedonism. Even if we naturally seek pleasure, it does not follow from it that we ought to seek that pleasure. And the last limitation which I would like to discuss, however there can be many others, is that his hedonistic calculus is unworkable. Bentham holds that the surplus of pleasure over pain is the guarantee of the rightness of an action. According to him, the calculation of the balance between pleasure and pain are concrete things, and they can be added and subtracted. The paradox of pleasure is that pleasure may disappear in the process of it being measured. So the more we weigh or the more we seek pleasure, the less we get it. Now, we come now to another version of utilitarianism given by J.S. Mill. Mill was influenced by the ideas of egalitarianism and benevolence in the doctrine given by Bentham. However, he was aware of the shortcomings and he revised the thesis to ensure a larger acceptance. On the lines of Bentham, Mill had argued that happiness is regarded as an end which all actions aim to achieve, and it constituted the standard on the basis of which the moral rightness or wrongness was to be adjudicated. J.S. Mill has given a qualitative version of utilitarianism. Mill argues, and I quote, "Actions are right in proportion as they produce happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness," unquote. Another place he says, and I quote, "By happiness is intended pleasure and absence of pain, by unhappiness or misery, pain and privation of pleasure," unquote. Mill draws qualitative distinctions. Some type of pleasures are higher or superior than certain others. Some type of pleasures are more valuable, more important to human happiness than other lower ones. Humans are capable of higher intellectual pleasures like feeling, imagination, intellectual rigor. These higher pleasures are placed above the bodily desires and appetites. For instance, the pleasure of listening to music or reading a good book is generally held to be higher and intellectually superior in quality to the pleasure of maybe eating food. It is significant to note that Mill brings in the idea of competent judge to decide which pleasures will be superior to others. If one of the two pleasures is preferred by the competent judges, that is, if almost everyone who has experience of two types of pleasures prefers one type over the other, even if that type of pleasure brings more pain with it, then the type that they prefer must be more valuable. Or why else will this judge, the competent judge as Mill talks about, will ever prefer that pleasure? So according to Mill, people desire superior pleasures more. One can agree with Mill that pleasures can be rated as superior or inferior. The pleasures derived out of benevolence are superior in quality to those of self-indulgence, even though their actual intensity may be less. In superior pleasures, the degree of pleasantness determines the superiority. So we tend to use the word happiness when drawing attention to the pleasantness of the more permanent and more desirable kinds of enjoyments. So as long as our physical needs are met, we prefer the pleasures of thought, feeling and imagination to pleasures of the body. Even though our higher capacities also mean we can experience terrible pain, boredom and dissatisfaction, and human beings are capable of experiencing boredom and pain because of their mental agility. Owing to the sense of human dignity, which is an essential part of our happiness, we prefer higher pleasures. For instance, They would prefer to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig being satisfied. This is a very famous quote by J.S. Mill. That is, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool being satisfied. By now, we have already gathered the utilitarian claim that happiness is the only good. However, the key point remains that what is good is what we should aim at in our actions and lives. So, Mill also derives what ought to be the case from what is actually the case. Therefore, we should aim at what is desirable. So, people in general desire happiness. This brings us to Mill's articulation about about happiness as an end. Mill says, and I quote, questions about ends are, in other words, questions what things are desirable. The utilitarian doctrine is that happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being only desirable as a means to the end, unquote. So, happiness clearly is the intrinsic end which all our endeavors should be focused towards. Mill proves that pleasure is the only thing that is desirable, and all other things are desirable only as means to pleasure. Since everyone wants happiness, so it is reasonable to infer that happiness is desirable. Mill provides a proof of utilitarianism, and I quote, "The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people actually hear it. And so, of the other sources of our experience. In the like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it," unquote. So, the greatest happiness principle is that each person's own pleasure or happiness is desirable for that person. So, general happiness ought to be good for an aggregate of all persons. So, the principle argues that we ought to act in a manner or choose that course of action which stands to maximize happiness and minimize unhappiness. Each person's own pleasure or happiness is desirable for that person, so the general happiness is also desirable. Each person desires his own so far as he considers it to be attainable. Utilitarian then argues that each person's happiness being good plus impartiality for each and every individual, and no one's happiness counts more than anyone else's, so there is also a commitment to equality. Each person takes their own happiness to be good, so adding each person's happiness to that of others, the happiness of everyone is good for other people in general. At this stage, we encounter a critical question: is happiness the only good? Then what about truth, beauty, wealth, knowledge, freedom, and all other goods? People desire many different things as good. Mill responds that that happiness has many other ingredients, and each ingredient is desirable in itself. For example, when someone desires to know the truth of for its own sake, in this situation, their happiness consists in knowing the truth. They desire other things as a means to pleasure. Mill claims whatever we desire for its own sake is part of what happiness is for us. Mill clearly appeals here for two principles or sanctions for altruistic conduct, namely the external sanctions like physical, social, religious, and political, and internal sanctions. The sanctions are on our conscience like sympathy, fellow being, social feelings of mankind, happiness of other people around us, a desire to be in unity with other fellow beings, kind of a call of duty and obligation. So, Mill takes recourse to both the sanctions, external and internal. Here, I would like to very briefly mention Henry Sidgwick's contribution to utilitarianism, and he talks about the important role of free reasoning in determining the supreme ideal law of utilitarianism, when he argues that the greatest happiness of the greatest number is a purely free ideal and a rational choice, because everyone knows that others' unhappiness can never result in their own unhappiness. So, we can achieve a universally acceptable moral ideal only when we appeal to the universal faculty of reason in us. Sidgwick has suggested 4 moral principles as holding of value, out of which the most important one is that a rational being should aim at realizing good, And what is right for one person in certain circumstances is also right for others in the similar circumstances. From the point of view of reason, the good of all people is then equal. However, one can question the introduction of rationalism or reason in utilitarian theory, because in the beginning of the lecture we started by saying that utilitarianism takes recourse to empiricism for its theory building. Also, Sidgwick's idea that pleasure are derivable from God's benevolence and omnipotence can be further questioned. To conclude, I would like to say that in this lecture, when we explore the two different versions of utilitarianism given by Bentham and J.S. Mill, we see the contrast between the two versions, namely the quantitative and the qualitative versions of utilitarianism. In the coming lecture, we will discuss about the act and the rule utilitarianism, along with the several criticisms which have been raised against Mill's version of utilitarianism.